the notes that Savannah Guthrie believes could be real. It's interesting, Harvey Levin is saying that the FBI told him that they believe that those notes are real, those two that I'm talking about, not the ones from this person, but the other two where they claim to actually be the kidnapper. And Harvey Levin is saying that the FBI believes those two are real, which would go along with what Savannah Guthrie said in that interview with Hoda. Remember, she said she tends to believe that two of the notes are real too. So that she's probably getting that information from the FBI. That would make sense. And remember, at least with the local TV station, I found out that those two notes that Savannah tends to believe are real, and according to Harvey Levin, the FBI also believes are real, were not just emailed to the local TV station in Tucson. They were sent in through a form. Like, you know, when you go to a website and you actually fill out a form and then you click submit? That's the way that it was done, I am told, which could be part of the reason that the FBI has had a hard time tracing back who these people are. At the same time, it is kind of shocking that it's been 66 days and that with all of the technology of the FBI, they don't have a way to figure out who sent those messages to the local TV station that they tend to believe are real, and who's sending these messages to TMZ, which it seems to be a different person. So I am surprised that the FBI still hasn't been able to figure that out with all the technology they have, but apparently whoever did this had a really good way of staying secret. So Levin says that they were working with the FBI, that the FBI was working with their TMZ team trying to figure out who has...
The call came in like any other update. Another development, another lead, another reason to believe the case was still moving forward. But this time, something felt different, because the new information didn't just add to the investigation, it pulled it in a completely different direction. Brian ENTIN had been following this case from the beginning. He had stood outside the house. He had walked the perimeter. He had asked the same questions everyone else was asking. What happened that night? Where did she go? Who was responsible? But now, weeks into the investigation, the focus was no longer on the house. It was shifting outward, away from the cameras, away from the front door, away from the place where everything was supposed to have started. And that shift didn't happen by accident. According to investigators, something had been found. Not inside the home, not along the expected path, but miles away, in a place that didn't make immediate sense. And the moment that detail surfaced, it raised a question that no one could ignore. If the abduction happened quickly, if the plan was to get in and get out, then why was anything showing up out there at all? That question alone was enough to change how people were looking at this case. But it wasn't the only one, because at the same time this new lead was being examined, another detail, one that had been there from the very beginning, was starting to take on a different meaning. A gap, 41 minutes, from 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m. At first, it was just a timeline detail, a technical note, the period between when the doorbell camera stopped recording and when the pacemaker signal went silent. But now, investigators were looking at it differently, because when you place that gap next to what was just found in the field, it doesn't feel like missing time anymore. It feels like used time. Time that may have been controlled. Time that may have been planned for. And once that idea enters the conversation, everything begins to shift. Because a random act doesn't usually create silence like that. A rushed escape doesn't line up with carefully placed evidence miles away. And that is where the case starts to split into two completely different possibilities. On one side, you still have the version people were told early on, an elderly woman, alone at night, a possible wandering scenario, a situation that, at least at first glance, didn't immediately signal something more serious. But on the other side, you have what is starting to emerge now, a sequence of events that suggests awareness, timing, preparation, and control. That contrast is what Brian ENTIN began to focus on as he followed this new lead. Because when a case moves from the expected path to something unfamiliar, it usually means one thing. Something was missed. Not ignored on purpose. Not hidden intentionally. But misunderstood in the moment when it mattered most. And in investigations like this, those early moments, they don't just pass. They shape everything that comes after. According to sources close to the case, the first hours after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing may not have been treated as a full crime scene. At the time, there was no confirmed sign of forced entry, no immediate indication of a violent struggle, and because of that, the situation may have been approached as something else entirely. A search, not an abduction. At first, that distinction doesn't seem like much, but when you look closer, it changes everything. Because when investigators believe they are looking for a person who wandered off, the priority becomes movement. You search, you expand outward, you try to locate. But when investigators believe they are dealing with a crime scene, the priority becomes preservation. You secure, you isolate, you protect every possible detail. And once that difference becomes clear, a much harder question starts to form. What if the case was treated one way, when it should have been treated another? What if the first critical hours were spent looking outward, instead of locking everything down? Because if that happened, then whatever was left behind in those early moments may not have been captured the way it needed to be. And that possibility is now being discussed more openly. Not as a confirmed conclusion, but as a concern that becomes even more serious when you connect it to what Brian ENTIN is now seeing in the field. Because the evidence being examined today should have been impossible to miss, unless it wasn't there yet, or unless no one was looking for it in the right way. And that brings us back to the location, the place where this new lead was found, because it wasn't just the presence of items that stood out. It was where they were, positioned in a way that didn't suggest panic, not scattered, not abandoned in a rush, but placed. That detail alone changes how investigators interpret behavior. Because when someone is in a hurry, they make mistakes, they drop things, they leave traces behind without thinking. But when something is placed carefully, it suggests the opposite. It suggests time and confidence. And that leads to a question that is far more unsettling than anything that came before it. What if the person responsible wasn't rushing at all? What if they believed they had enough control over the situation to slow down? Because if that's true, then this wasn't just about getting away. It was about executing something that had already been thought through. And that possibility doesn't just change the timeline, it changes the profile. Because now, instead of asking who could do something like this in the moment, you have to ask who could plan it ahead of time, who understood the area, who knew how to move without being noticed, and who had a reason to be close enough without raising suspicion. That is where the investigation is starting to narrow, not outward, but inward, toward presence, toward access, toward familiarity. And as Brian ENTIN continues to follow this lead, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The answer may not be hidden in some distant location. It may be much closer than anyone initially expected. But that brings up one more question. If the evidence is only being found now, what changed? And why is it showing up at this point in the investigation and not earlier? Because the timing of that discovery may matter just as much as the discovery itself. And in cases like this, timing is never random. If you're following this case closely, take a moment to subscribe and stay with it. Because what comes next begins to connect this location to something much bigger, something that goes back to the very first night. And once that connection is clear, it raises the possibility that this wasn't just planned. It may have been watched long before it happened. And that changes everything. The moment you consider that possibility, that this may have been watched beforehand, the entire case begins to shift again. Because planning doesn't start on the night something happens. It starts long before. And if someone was observing that house, studying it, understanding its routines, then the question is no longer just what happened that night. It becomes something much more specific. How long had they been there without being noticed? That question is now sitting at the center of the investigation, not officially stated as a conclusion, but increasingly difficult to ignore. Because when Brian ENTIN began looking deeper into the area surrounding the home, one detail kept coming up again and again. The layout, not just of the house, but of the neighborhood itself. This wasn't a crowded street where people come and go unnoticed. This was a quiet, spaced-out residential area. Homes set apart, limited traffic, familiar routines. In places like that, people don't just blend in, they stand out. And yet, according to investigators, someone was able to approach that house late at night, interfere with surveillance, enter, remain there for a period of time, and leave. Number 4. Without triggering an immediate reaction from anyone nearby. That doesn't happen easily. Not in an environment like that. Which is why some investigators now believe this wasn't a random approach. It was a confident one. The kind of confidence that only comes from knowing what to expect. Knowing when lights go off. Knowing when the area goes quiet. Knowing when no one is watching. And once that idea is on the table, another piece of the puzzle starts to make more sense. The property nearby. A house that, according to reports, may not have been occupied at the time. At first, it sounds like a small detail. But in a neighborhood like this, it matters. Because an unoccupied house changes the rhythm of an area. It creates a gap, a space where movement becomes harder to track, where a vehicle can appear without being tied to a familiar pattern, where someone can come and go without drawing attention. And according to sources, that possibility has not gone unnoticed. Investigators have reportedly returned to that specific location, not for a general search, but with a focused purpose. And when that happens in a case like this, it usually means something new has entered the picture. Not speculation, not theory, but information, because you don't go back to the same place weeks later unless there is a reason, a connection, a detail that didn't mean much at first, but now does. And that brings up another question. If that property was being used in any way, even briefly, what would it have allowed someone to do? The answer is simple and unsettling. It would have allowed them to be there, without explaining why, to park a car, to walk the area, to observe, to learn, and most importantly, to do all of that without raising suspicion, because if someone asks, the answer is already there. I live nearby. That kind of cover doesn't just protect movement. It enables it, and when you connect that possibility to what was found in the desert, the picture starts to sharpen, because now you're not just looking at a single moment in time. You're looking at a sequence. Observation, preparation, execution, movement, and then silence. That silence, the same one marked by the 4 one-minute gap, is starting to look less like a missing piece, and more like a controlled transition. A window where everything that needed to happen, happened. But there's another layer to this. One that doesn't involve location, or terrain, or even physical movement. It involves data. Because while all of this is being analyzed on the ground, something else is happening behind the scenes. Something far less visible, but just as important. Digital tracing. According to investigators, devices in the area are being examined. Not just for activity, but for patterns. Because in cases like this, presence isn't always obvious. Sometimes it shows up in repetition. A device that appears near a location more than once. A signal that connects, disconnects, and then reappears again. Even a gap, a moment where something should be active, but isn't. Those details matter, because even silence leaves a trace. And that's where things begin to narrow. Because if someone was operating near that house, using equipment, monitoring movement, then at some point, their devices would have interacted with the environment. Wi-Fi networks, cell towers, nearby signals, even if only briefly. And once those interactions are logged, they can be compared, cross-referenced, layered over time, until patterns begin to form. This is the stage investigators appear to be entering now, not expanding outward, but tightening inward, from possibility to probability, from environment to individual, and that shift is critical. Because once the investigation moves into that phase, the question changes again. It's no longer, what could have happened here? It becomes, who was actually there? And that is a much more dangerous question. Because now, the list isn't infinite. It's finite. It includes people who had a reason to be in that area. People connected to nearby properties. People involved in activities that would place them there without raising concern. Construction, maintenance, short-term occupancy, temporary presence. Each of those categories creates access. And access, in a case like this, is everything. Because whoever did this didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were close enough to understand the environment, close enough to move with confidence, close enough to not be noticed. And that is where another detail starts to take on more weight. A report from a resident. Someone who mentioned seeing a figure in the area weeks before the incident. Nothing dramatic, no confrontation, just a presence. Brief, unfamiliar, and then gone. At the time, it didn't mean much. But now, it fits. Because when you place that sighting next to everything else, the timeline begins to stretch backward. Not just to the night of the disappearance, but to the days, or even weeks, before it. And that possibility introduces a new kind of tension, because it suggests this may not have been a single act. It may have been a process, a buildup, a series of small, unnoticed moments, leading to one very deliberate one. And that brings us back to Brian ENTIN, because as he continues to follow these leads, one realization is becoming harder to ignore. This case isn't expanding anymore. It's narrowing. Every new detail, every returned location, every layer of data being analyzed, it's all pointing towards something more focused, more specific, closer. But there is still one problem. Even with all of this, there is no confirmed identity. Not yet. Because while physical evidence can point to behavior, and digital traces can suggest presence, there is still one piece missing. A name. And right now, that name may be sitting behind something investigators haven't fully resolved yet. Something that has been there from the beginning, but hasn't been fully unlocked. The DNA. Because according to experts, the samples collected are not simple. They're mixed, overlapping, layered with multiple profiles, which means the answer may already be in the system, just not clear enough to isolate. And until that happens, everything else remains just short of confirmation. But that may be about to change. Because new technology, new methods, and new pressure on this case are beginning to push that process forward. And if that DNA can finally be separated, if a clean profile can be pulled from it, then everything we've just talked about, the location, the movement, the presence, the preparation, it all connects to one thing, a person. And once that happens, the case doesn't just move forward, it accelerates. But here's the part that investigators are now starting to confront. What if that answer was almost within reach from the very beginning? And what if something in those first critical hours made it harder to get there? Because in the next part, the focus shifts again, away from the field, away from the terrain, and back to something much more uncomfortable. The way this case was handled when it first began, and whether the biggest break in this investigation wasn't missed in the desert, but in the first 48 hours. When investigators start looking backward instead of forward, it usually means one thing. Something in the beginning doesn't sit right anymore. And in this case, that shift is becoming impossible to ignore. Because everything we've walked through so far, the desert evidence, the controlled movement, the possibility of prior observation, the digital silence, all of it leads back to one critical window, the first 48 hours. Not because everything happened then, but because everything that followed depends on how those hours were handled. According to investigators and sources close to the case, the initial response may not have matched what the situation actually was. At the time, there was no confirmed forced entry, no obvious signs of struggle inside the home. And because of that, the working assumption leaned towards something less severe, a missing person, possibly a wandering scenario. At face value, that assumption is understandable. But in investigations like this, assumptions don't just guide decisions, they define them. Because once a case is framed a certain way, everything that follows begins to align with that frame. Search patterns, response units, priority actions, and most importantly, what gets protected and what doesn't. When a scene is treated as a search effort, the focus moves outward. You look for the person, you expand the radius, you move quickly. But when a scene is treated as a potential crime, everything stops. You lock it down. You preserve it. You treat every inch as if it might hold the answer. And that difference may be where this case changed. Because if the early response focused on movement instead of preservation, then some of the most important details may not have been captured the way they needed to be. Not lost intentionally, not ignored, but simply not recognized in time. And that possibility becomes more serious when you consider what we now know. A 1-minute gap that looks controlled. Evidence placed in a way that suggests planning. A nearby property that could explain presence. And signs that someone may have been observing the area before the night everything happened. Those are not elements of a spontaneous situation. They are elements of a structured one. and structured events leave traces. But only if those traces are preserved early enough. That's the concern investigators are now quietly working through. Not as a public conclusion, but as a reality they have to account for. Because once the initial window passes, you don't get it back. You work with what remains. And what remains, in this case, is now being pushed to its limits. Which is why the focus has shifted so heavily toward the lab. The DNA. Because unlike physical scenes, which can be altered, disturbed, or degraded, biological evidence, if it exists, holds its structure. It doesn't change its story. It just needs to be understood. But in this case, that process hasn't been simple. According to experts, the DNA collected is mixed. Multiple profiles layered together, which makes immediate identification extremely difficult. Traditional systems rely on clean samples, clear matches, direct comparison. But when profiles overlap, the answer is still there. It's just buried. And separating it requires more than time. It requires technology, new methods, more advanced analysis, which is exactly where this case is heading now. Because investigators are no longer just waiting for a match. They're waiting for separation. The ability to isolate one profile from the rest. To remove what belongs to the family and retain what doesn't. The unknown. The one piece that doesn't fit. Because once that piece is isolated, everything else we've discussed begins to lock into place. The movement, the presence, the preparation, all of it becomes anchored to something real, a person, and that is the moment every investigation moves toward. The shift from theory to identity. But here's where the tension remains. Because even with all of this progress, that moment hasn't happened yet, not publicly, which means the case is sitting in a very specific phase, not expanding. Not stalled, but tightening, quietly, carefully, behind the scenes. And that kind of silence can be misleading. From the outside, it feels like nothing is happening. No major announcements, no dramatic updates, no clear answers. But internally, this is often where the most important work is being done, where data is being compared, where patterns are being tested, where names are being considered and eliminated. Because by this stage, the investigation isn't asking broad questions anymore. It's asking very narrow ones. Who had access? Who had proximity? Who had the ability to move without being noticed? And who had a reason? That last question, reason, is the one that changes everything. Because access explains presence. Proximity explains movement. But reason explains intent. And intent is what connects all the pieces. The house, the gap, the desert, the evidence, the silence. All of it leads back to that one point. Why? Why this house? Why this timing? Why this method? Because when something is planned, those choices are never random. They are selected, which means somewhere in this case, there is a connection, something that links the person responsible to the environment they operated in. And that connection is what investigators are now trying to confirm. Not guess, not assume, but prove. Because until that happens, everything remains just short of closure. And that is where this case stands right now. Not solved, not forgotten, but waiting. Waiting for that one point of clarity. That one detail that moves everything from possibility to certainty. And when that happens, it won't feel like a new discovery. It will feel like everything finally makes sense. But until then, one question still hangs over everything we've covered. Not what happened, not even how, but this. If the evidence suggests planning, if the movement suggests control, if the silence suggests intention, then how long had this been building? Before anyone even realized something was wrong? Because if that answer comes out, it won't just explain the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. It will explain everything that led up to it. And maybe more importantly, everything that was missed along the way. If you've followed this case this far, stay with it. Subscribe and keep watching closely. Because when this case finally breaks, it won't come from a loud moment. It will come from something small, something precise, something that has been there the entire time, waiting to be seen.